Horror story. It was around 2 in the morning when I heard it for the first time, a scream muffled and distant but unmistakably filled with terror. I had been lying in bed, tossing and turning, trying to fight off the unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't place it, but something about the silence of the house seemed off. I propped myself up, straining my ears, listening to the darkness. And then it came again, a sharp, piercing cry that sounded like it was coming from deep below the house, somewhere far beneath the wooden floorboards. My skin prickled. It was a horrible sound, like someone, or something, was in agony, their voice distorted by the distance, and something else. Something unnatural. Without thinking, I bolted out of bed and went straight to my older brother's room. He was the one who always calmed me down when things got too weird, too eerie to handle alone. I remember shaking him awake, my voice cracking as I tried to explain the scream I had just heard. But he just rubbed his eyes, groggy and annoyed. "Go back to sleep," he muttered, not even fully awake. "You're imagining things. It's just your head playing tricks on you. Besides, it's 2 in the morning. No one's screaming, you probably heard some stray animal or something." I stared at him in disbelief. How could he not have heard it? It was so loud, so horrifying, that there was no way it was just in my head. But he pulled the covers over himself, turned his back to me, and within minutes, his soft snores filled the room again. He didn't hear it. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it deafening in my ears as I stood there in the dark. Frustrated and more than a little freaked out, I returned to my room. But sleep wouldn't come, not easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that scream echoing in my mind. It had felt so real, too real to ignore. I lay there in bed, wide-eyed, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. Minutes turned into hours, and eventually exhaustion started to win. My eyelids grew heavy, and I felt myself beginning to drift into that hazy space between sleep and consciousness. And that's when I heard it again. This time the scream was louder, sharper, like it was right beneath my bed. A high-pitched wail that twisted and distorted, as if whatever was making the sound was no longer fully human. I shot up, my heart slamming against my ribcage as cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck. It wasn't just a scream. No, this time it was something worse, like the sound of a girl, but there was something horribly wrong with her voice. The way it echoed in my room, bouncing off the walls, filled me with a terror I had never felt before. It was as if her voice was being stretched, mangled by something dark and hungry. My mind raced, my body frozen in place. My brother was fast asleep in the next room, oblivious. I wanted to scream myself, to shout and wake him up again, but I couldn't. Something was stopping me. I felt paralyzed by fear, as if that sound had rooted me to the bed, holding me hostage in the thick, suffocating darkness. I almost jumped out of bed, but something kept me still. Some deep, primal instinct told me that moving, reacting, acknowledging the sound would make it worse. So I stayed, trembling under the blankets, eyes wide, staring into the void of my room as the scream seemed to fade into the walls. But it wasn't over. No, it was just beginning. I couldn't shake the sound from my mind, the way that scream seemed to twist into words, begging for help. It sounded like a girl's voice, young but broken, like she was barely clinging to her sanity. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it away. My brother's reassurances were useless now. There was someone out there. Someone who needed help. The air in the room felt thick, stifling, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me, urging me to move, to do something. I was only 15, but something inside me, a mix of fear and foolish bravery, drove me out of bed. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I slipped on my sneakers and quietly left the apartment, not bothering to wake my brother this time. He wouldn't believe me anyway. The hallway was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that crawls under your skin and makes you question every shadow, every flicker of movement from the corner of your eye. I stepped out into the dimly lit corridor, each step sending a faint echo bouncing off the concrete walls. I had no real plan, no idea what I was doing, but I felt like I was being pulled by something, a force I couldn't explain. I knew I had to go down to the lower floors. The stairwell smelled of stale air and rust, the kind of smell that clings to old, forgotten places. I descended, counting each step in my head, trying to calm my racing thoughts. For floors down, that's where I had to go. What? I didn't know. But the further I went, the more the atmosphere seemed to change, growing denser, darker. It felt like the walls were closing in, and with every floor I passed, the temperature dropped, leaving a cold sweat clinging to my skin. When I reached the 4th floor below, I stopped. The air felt wrong. Heavy, like something invisible was suffocating the space around me, pressing down on my chest. The lights flickered weakly, casting long, warped shadows that danced across the peeling paint on the walls. I stood there, frozen, trying to listen for the scream again, for any sign that I wasn't completely insane. And then, as if in response to my growing fear, the door directly in front of me burst open. I had no time to react. It happened so fast. One moment the door was closed, the next it was flying towards me with the force of a hurricane. It slammed into me hard, knocking the breath from my lungs and sending me sprawling backward onto the cold, hard floor. My vision blurred, and the world around me spun as I tried to pull myself up, but I couldn't. A sharp pain shot through my skull, and before I could even make sense of what was happening, everything went black. When I woke, everything felt wrong. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and there was an odd brightness around me, but it wasn't the familiar glow of the flickering hallway lights. It was too white, too sterile. I tried to move, but something was holding me down. My arms, my legs, bound by something tight and coarse. Panic surged through me as I struggled to free myself, my heart racing as my mind tried to make sense of where I was. That's when I saw her. A figure, just barely visible in the whiteness around me. Her hair was long and dark, matted and tangled, hanging over her face like a curtain of shadow. She was dragging me, pulling my body through some sort of narrow corridor. I couldn't see where we were going, couldn't make sense of any of it. The walls were white, the floor was white, everything blindingly bright. But despite the brightness, the air felt thick with darkness, like something malevolent was hiding just beneath the surface, watching me, waiting. My throat was dry and I tried to speak, to ask her who she was, what she was doing, but no sound came out. It was like the air had been stolen from my lungs. All I could hear was the faint sound of her labored breathing and something else. Other voices, faint, far away but unmistakable. Children's voices. Suddenly the girl stopped. She didn't turn to face me, didn't even seem to acknowledge that I was conscious. She just let go of my legs and vanished into the whiteness, leaving me lying there helpless. For a brief moment I thought I had imagined it all, that this was some bizarre, vivid nightmare I couldn't wake from. Then the door behind me slammed shut. I barely had time to react before rough hands grabbed me, yanking me off the floor and dragging me into a small, dimly lit room. The brightness from before was gone, replaced by a suffocating darkness, the air thick and rank with the smell of mold and decay. My wrists were bound to the arms of a wooden chair, and as my vision adjusted to the dim light, I saw them, the others. There were at least 4 other children, all around my age, their eyes wide and vacant, bound and gagged in the corners of the room. Their faces were pale, hollow, like the life had been drained from them. They looked at me, but their gazes were empty, devoid of hope, of anything human. Then I saw her again. The girl, the one who had dragged me here, stood in the center of the room, staring at me with cold, dead eyes. Her lips twisted into a cruel, unnatural smile as she stepped closer, her hands twitching, trembling with some kind of manic energy. I tried to scream, to move, but the ropes held me tight, biting into my skin. And then she screamed. It was the same scream I had heard earlier, but this time it was right in front of me, raw and visceral, shaking me to my core. She lunged at me, her fists slamming into my chest over and over, her voice rising into a piercing wail as she shrieked, "Help me! Help me! You have to help me!" Each word was like a punch, her fists hitting me with a ferocity that didn't match her frail frame. I could feel my chest tightening, the air being squeezed from my lungs as the pain seared through me. The other children in the room didn't move, didn't react. They just sat there, motionless, watching, as if they had seen this all before, as if they knew what was coming. But I didn't. It wasn't until the darkness crept in around me, swallowing the last bits of light, that I realized it was too late. It was already too late.